Hello. I wish you doing well. Today we'll all talk about Che Guevara. Let's get started. Cuban-born Marxist Argentine, revolutionary, physician, writer, guerrilla leader, military commander, world statesman, and leading figure in the Cuban Revolution. His embellished image since his death has become an ubiquitous symbol and emblem within the popular culture. He's born June 14, 1928. The oldest of 5 children in a family of Irish and Spanish Basque. His legal name, Ernesto Che Guevara, appears in relation to his surnames at times with the addition of de la Serna or Lynch to him. In shedding light on Che's unstable nature, his father mentioned that the first thing we can observe is that my son runs through the blood of the Irish rebels. Very early in life, he developed for Ernestito, as he was then called Guevara, feeling of sympathy for the poor. Growing up in a family with leftist leanings, Guevara dealt with a wide range of political views. Even while he was a boy, his father was a strong supporter of the Republicans from the Spanish Civil War and often hosted many encounters between veterans at his home. Despite suffering from severe asthma attacks that Guevara suffered throughout his life, he excelled as an athlete and enjoyed swimming, playing soccer, golf and shooting, but also became cycling and knows no fatigue or boredom. He was an avid player in rugby and half player on the team of the University of Buenos Aires. While playing rugby, he earned the nickname Fuser, acronym for Bando, which means flaming Arabic, and his mother's family name de la Serna, for his aggressive playing style. His schoolmates also abused him Shinkau, which in Arabic means pig, because he rarely took a shower, and he proudly wore the weak shirt. Guevara learned chess from his father and started participating in local championships when he was 12 years old. Throughout his teenage years and throughout his life, Guevara was passionate about poetry, especially poet Pablo Neruda, John Keats, Antonio Machado, Federico Garcia Lorca, Gabriela Mistral, Cesar Paillo and Walt Whitman. He could quote verses of poetry by Rudyard Kipling and also by José Hernández by heart. Guevara's home contained more than 3,000 books, which allowed him to be an enthusiastic and eclectic reader, as he read about Karl Marx, William Faulkner, André Gide, Emilio Salgari and Jules Verne. In addition, Guevara was reading the works of Jawaharlal Nehru, Franz Kafka, Albert Camus, Vladimir Lenin and Jean-Paul Sartre, as well as Anatole France, Friedrich Engels, Herbert George Wells and Robert Frost. When he grew up, Guevara became interested in reading Latin American writers such as Horacio Quiroga, Cerro Alegria, Jorge Acaza, Robin Dario, and Miguel Asturias. Guevara codified the ideas of many of these writers in his own handwriting writings with his concepts and definitions, and the philosophies of prominent intellectuals from his point of view, and also undertook some analytical studies of Buddha and Aristotle, along with his study of Bertrand Russell on love and patriotism, society from Jack London and Nietzsche's idea of death. Guevara adopted the ideas of Sigmund Freud, who took him up on a variety of topics such as dreams, sexual desire, narcissism and Oedipus complex. His favorite subjects at the school included philosophy, mathematics, engineering, political science, sociology, history, and archaeology. On February 13, 1958, the CIA released a classified biography and personal report that indicated that Guevara had a diverse background of academic interests and thought, describing him as a good reader and commented that Che is an intellectual despite being of Hispanic origin. In 1948, Guevara entered the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine. In 1951, he took a 1-year vacation to embark on a South American bike ride with his friend Alberto Granado. The ultimate goal was to spend a few weeks volunteering at the San Pablo leprosy colony in Peru on the banks of the Amazon River. On the way to Machu Picchu, which is high in the Andes, Guevara was stunned by the poverty of remote rural areas, where peasants worked on small plots of land owned by wealthy owners. On his journey, Guevara admired the intimate friendship between those who live in colonies of leprosy, saying, "It is the highest form of human solidarity and loyalty that arises among people in such lowliness and despair." Guevara used the notes he took during this trip to write a book called Motorcycle Diary, which became the best-selling book as described by the New York Times, where he later received an award in 2004 for a film adapted from him of the same name. At the end of this trip, Guevara reached the conclusion that Latin America is not a group of separate states, but a single entity that requires a continent-wide liberation strategy. His conception of the United States on the continent of Hispanic America without borders, which shared a common Latin heritage, was a prominent topic that was repeated during his revolutionary activities later. On his return to Argentina, he completed his studies and obtained his medical degree in June 1953, which made him officially Ernesto Guevara. Through his travels to Latin America, Guevara concluded that there was a close connection between poverty, hunger and disease, with the inability to treat a child due to lack of money, and a coma-provoking constant hunger and punishment that leads the father to accept the loss of the son as an accident important. These experiences, which Guevara cites, convinced that in order to help these people, he needed to leave the field of medicine and look at the political scene in search of armed struggle. Guevara set off again on July 7, 1953, this time to Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. On December 10, 1953, before he went to Guatemala, Guevara sent a message to his aunt, Beatriz, living in San Jose, Costa Rica. In the letter, Guevara mentioned the transit of the property of the United Fruit Company, which convinced him of the terrible reality of capitalism, the octopus. This indignation carried the tone of the desire for revenge that he relied on to intimidate more of his conservative relatives, and continued with Guevara even when he swore at the grave of Joseph Stalin when he died, that he would not rest until these octopuses are overcome. Guevara arrived in Guatemala in the same month as President Jacobo Arbenz headed a democratically elected government and was trying, through land reform and other initiatives, to end the feudal system. To accomplish this, President Arbenz enacted a major land reform program, in which all parts of uncultivated land with large holdings were to be confiscated and redistributed to landless peasants. The largest landowner and one of the owners most affected by these reforms is the United Fruit Company, which the Arbenz government has already withdrawn more than 225,000 acres of ownership. After being satisfied with the way this country has taken, Guevara decided to settle in Guatemala to prepare himself and accomplish what may be necessary in order to become a true revolutionary. In Guatemala City, Guevara sought to identify Haile J.D. Acosta, an Peruvian economist who had many political backgrounds as a member of the left-wing movement of the Revolutionary Popular Alliance Party, Americana. Guevara came to a number of high-ranking officials of the Arbenz government. After that, Guevara became acquainted with a group of Cuban exiles associated with Fidel Castro by the attack of the 26th of July 1953 on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. And Guevara acquired his famous title during this period due to the frequent use of the Argentinian abbreviation, Che, which is a casual colloquial word that is used like a boyfriend or friend. Guevara's attempts to obtain medical training were unsuccessful, and his economic situation often prevented him from doing so. On May 15, 1954, a group of infantry with Skoda guns and light weapons was sent by the communist Czechoslovakia to the Arbenz government, where it arrived in Puerto Barrios. As a result, the CIA and the army invaded the country and installed the right-wing dictator Carlos Castillo Armas in judgment. Guevara was eager to fight on behalf of Arbenz, and even joined the armed militias organized by the communist youth for this purpose. But he was frustrated by the group's failure to work and soon returned to medical care, and in the aftermath of the coup he volunteered to fight again. But soon after that Arbenz resorted to the Mexican embassy and advising his foreign supporters to leave the country. Guevara's repeated calls for resistance were noted by the supporters of the coup, and a desire to assassinate him was announced. After the arrest of Haile J.D., Guevara sought refuge in the Argentine consulate, where he remained there until he obtained a safe exit permit. A few weeks later, he went to Mexico. Guevara married Haile J.D. in Mexico in September 1955. The intervention to topple the Arbenz regime reinforced Guevara's view of the United States as a colonial power that would oppose an attempt to destroy any government seeking to address endemic social and economic inequality in Latin America and other developing countries. Guevara was convinced that the realization of Marxism was only achieved through the armed struggle, which the armed people defended, and the only way to correct such conditions by strengthening them. Hilda Gadea wrote that Guatemala was the one that finally convinced him of the necessity of armed struggle, and of taking the lead against imperialism. When the time came to leave, he was confident then. Guevara arrived in Mexico City in early September 1954. He worked in the allergy department of the General Hospital, in addition to giving lectures on medicine at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and worked as a Latina press photographer for the news agency. During this time he renewed his friendship with Nico Lopez and other Cuban exiles whom he had met in Guatemala. In June 1955, Lopez Raúl Castro introduced him, who later introduced him to his older brother Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader who formed the July 26th movement and is now planning to topple dictator Batista. During a long discussion with Castro at their first meeting, Guevara concluded that the issue of this Cuban was what he was looking for, and before dawn he had joined as a member of the so-called July 26th movement. From this point in Guevara's life, he considered the United States to control blocks by installing and supporting repressive regimes around the world, and in this context Batista was considered a United States puppet to be removed. Although he was to be the paramedic of the combat group, he participated in military exercises with the movement's members. The main part of the training was to learn hit-and-run tactics in guerrilla warfare. Guevara and others underwent arduous training, including 15-hour marches in mountains, across rivers, and through dense bushes, learning and perfecting procedures for ambush and rapid retreat. From the start Guevara was Alberto Bayo's ideal student among those in training, scoring the highest on all of the exams involved. At the end of the course he was named Best Fighter by coach and Colonel Bayo. The first step in Castro's revolutionary plan was to attack Cuba from Mexico via Granma, an old filtering compound. They set out on November 25, 1956 to attack Cuba. Batista's army attacked them soon after landing, and many of the 82 fighters were killed in the attack, which only 22 men survived. Guevara wrote that during this bloody confrontation he threw medical supplies and picked up a box of ammunition from the remains of one of his fleeing comrades. This was a decisive step as he finally left medicine and became a fighter. A small group of revolutionaries remained alive to restore the group's shabby combat strength deep into the Sierra Maestra Mountains as they received support from the urban guerrilla network and from Frank Pace, as well as the July 26th movement and local peasants as the group withdrew to Sierra Leone. The world asked whether Castro was alive or dead until early 1957 when the interview was made with Herbert Matthews and appeared in an article in the New York Times. The article presented a permanent, semi-legendary portrayal of the image of Castro and the guerrillas. Guevara was not present for the interview, but in the months that followed he began to realize the importance of the media in their struggle. At this time supplies were declining as well as morale, and Guevara suffered from allergic reactions due to mosquito bites that resulted in painful abscesses the size of a nut on his body. Guevara considered this stage the most painful of the war. As the war continued, Guevara became an integral part of the army and rebels, and he persuaded Castro of his capabilities, diplomacy, and patience. Guevara set up factories to make grenades, built ovens to make bread, and new recruits studied tactics, and organized schools to teach illiterate peasants to read and write. Moreover, Guevara created health clinics, workshops to teach military tactics, and a newspaper to spread information. The man who 3 years later called Time magazine the mind of the revolution at this point was promoted by Fidel Castro to the second commander in the army. As the only warrior in the rank of commander alongside Fidel Castro, Guevara was extremely cruel about the discipline of the dissidents who had been shot without hesitation. The fugitives were punished as traitors, and Guevara was known to send death squads to chase those seeking to escape without permission. As a result, therefore, Guevara became fearful of his brutality and cruelty. During the guerrilla campaign, Guevara was also responsible for carrying out the death sentences on the spot for men accused of collaborating, fleeing, or often spying. Although Guevara maintained the harsh and severe system, he viewed the leader's role as an educator and was entertaining his men during breaks between skirmishes by reading the likes of Robert Louis Stevenson and Servants in Spanish lyric poetry. The Cuban commander described Fidel Castro Guevara as an intelligent, audacious and exemplary leader who had great moral authority over his forces. Castro also noticed that Guevara took so many risks that he even had a tendency to recklessly. Guevara had a key role in creating a secret radio station called Radio Rebelde. In February 1958, it was broadcasting news to the Cuban people with statements by the July 26th movement, and there was no radio communication between an increasing number of rebels across the island. It was clear that Guevara's inspiration for the establishment of the station was by observing the effectiveness of the CIA that broadcast Radio Guatemala to topple the government of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Late July 1958, Guevara played a decisive role in the Battle of Las Mercedes by using a group of warriors to stop the summons of 1,500 men by Batista, who were part of a plan to surround and destroy Castro's forces. Years later, Major Larry Buckman of the United States Marine Corps analyzed, described chase tactics for this battle as remarkable. Also during this time, Guevara became a leading expert on hit-and-run tactics against Batista's army, as he was beating and then fading again in the countryside before the army was able to counterattack. As the war continued, Guevara led a new group of fighters westward to make a final push toward Havana. Guevara traveled on foot, and it took 7 arduous weeks as he moved at night only to avoid ambushes, and he often did not eat for several days. In the last days of December 1958, Guevara had the task of dividing the island into two by capturing the province of Los Feliz. Within a few days he carried out a series of impressive tactical victories that allowed him to control all provinces, but without the capital, Santa Clara. Guevara directed his suicide squad to attack Santa Clara, which became the decisive end of the military victory of the revolution. In the 6 weeks leading up to the Battle of Santa Clara, there were times when men were completely surrounded and the enemy was outnumbered and numerous and almost overpowered. Kai eventually won, despite the enormous hardships and numerical superiority of the enemy, who reached 10-1, and these battles remain in the opinion of some observers a remarkable power war in modern wars. Radio Rebelde broadcast the first reports of Guevara's success in occupying Santa Clara on New Year's Eve in 1958. This contrasted with heavily censored media reports from national news that at one point announced Guevara's death during the fighting. At 3 a.m. on January 1, 1959, a separate peace was negotiated with Guevara, and Batista boarded a plane in Havana and fled to the Dominican Republic with his fortune estimated at more than $300 million through graft and bribes. On January 2nd, Guevara entered Havana for the final control of the capital. It took Fidel Castro more than 6 days to arrive, as he stopped to rally support in several big cities on his way to Havana on January 8, 1959. In February, the revolutionary government declared Guevara a Cuban citizen in recognition of his role in the victory. A law was issued giving citizenship and full citizenship to everyone who fought with the revolutionaries with the rank of colonel. And these specifications existed only in Guevara, who was appointed director of the central bank and supervised the trials of the opponents of the revolution in state building in a period when the revolution did not announce its communist face, and once the revolution took control of matters, especially the army, until the communist government in which Guevara was an industry minister, a Cuban representative abroad and a spokesperson for the United Nations was established. When Hilda Gatti arrived in Cuba in late January, Guevara told her that he had a relationship with another woman and they agreed to divorce, which took place on May 22. 60. On June 2, 1959, he married Alida Marsh, a Cuban-born member of the 26th of July movement, with whom he had lived since 1958. During the rebellion against Batista's dictatorship, the general command of the rebel army led by Fidel Castro entered the territories liberated from the penal code known as Ley de la Sierra. This law includes the imposition of the death penalty for very serious crimes committed by the dictator or supporters of the revolution. In 1959, the revolutionary government published law enforcement on the entire republic and on those it considered war criminals and arrested after the revolution. According to the Cuban Ministry of Justice, this latest amendment was supported by the majority of the population, follows the same procedures in the Nuremberg trials that the Allies held after World War II. To implement parts of this plan, Castro installed Guevara, commander of the La Habana prison, for 5 months, January 2 to June 12, 1959. Guevara was concerned with cleansing Batista's army and consolidating the victory of revolutionary justice against those considered traitors, informants, or war criminals. 65. While Guevara served as commander of the La Habana prison, who reviewed grievances from those convicted during the revolutionary court process. In some cases, the court's sentence was death by firing squad. Ra Gómez Treto, legal advisor at the Cuban Ministry of Justice, argued that the death penalty was justified in order to prevent citizens themselves from achieving justice with their own hands, as happened 20 years earlier during the counterinsurgency of Gerardo Machado. Biographies noted that in January 1959 the Cuban public was in the mood for extrajudicial executions, and indicated a referendum during that period showing 93% of public support for the arbitration process. 20,000 Cubans were killed by Batista agents. Many of those sentenced to death were accused of torture and physical assaults. And the government of the modern authority carried out executions without respecting due process of law. Although the exact number is disputed, it is estimated that several hundred people were executed during this time. There are conflicting views about how happy Guevara was about executions in Los Angeles, La Habana prison. Some opposition biographers published a report that he enjoyed the rites of execution by firing squad, and organized them with enthusiasm and impulsion. But what all parties have recognized is that Guevara has become a tougher man who does not refrain from applying the death penalty, undertaking swift procedures, or carrying out collective trials. If the only way to defend the revolution is to carry out executions on its enemies, it will not be affected by human or political arguments. This opinion is supported by a message found on February 5, 1959 between Luis López Paredes in Buenos Aires and Guevara, where the latter acknowledged unequivocally the shooting by the death squads is not only a necessity for the people of Cuba, but also an imposition. On June 12, 1959, Castro sent Guevara on a 3-month tour of 14 countries, mostly from the Bandung Pact and countries in Africa and Asia. Sending Guevara far from Havana allowed Castro to appear far from Che, who was sympathetic to Marxism, and that bothers the United States and some members of the movement. The Castro Movement, July 26. Guevara spent 12 days in Japan, from July 15 to 27, and participated in negotiations to expand Cuba's commercial relations with this country. During this visit, Guevara secretly visited the city of Hiroshima, where the U.S. military had detonated a nuclear bomb 14 years ago. Guevara shocked what he saw during his visit to the hospital where he was the survivors of the bomb under treatment. On his return to Cuba in September 1959, Castro now had more political power. The government had begun to seize the lands included in the agrarian reform law, but had to hedge and provide compensation to landowners, and instead offered low-interest bonds, which placed the United States alert. At this point, the livestock farmers affected by the wealthy in Camagüey launched a campaign against the redistribution of land with disaffected newly recruited and rebel leader Huber Matus, who stood side by side with the opposition part of the communist wing, and the July 26 movement joined them in denouncing the communist aggression. During this time, the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo provided assistance to the anti-communist Corps of the Caribbean, who was training in the Dominican Republic. This multinational force was mostly composed of Spaniards and Cubans as well as Croats, Germans, Greeks and the Red Wing of mercenaries, who were planning to topple the new Castro regime. These threats increased on March 4, 1960, when 2 explosions struck the French cargo ship La Cooper, which was carrying Belgian ordnance from the port of Antwerp, and docked at the port of Havana. The 2 explosions killed at least 76 people, injured several hundred and personally Guevara. Prior to some of the victims, the Cuban leader Fidel Castro immediately accused the CIA of terrorist act and held a state funeral the next day for the victims of the explosion. Alberto Corda attended the memorial ceremony and took the famous photo of Che Guevara, now known as guerrilla leader, as shown in the article template. These perceived threats prompted Castro to carry out a further counter-revolution, and to benefit from Guevara radically to increase the speed of land reform to implement this plan. A new government agency, the National Institute for Agrarian Reform (NRA), was created as a new department to implement the Agrarian Reform Law and soon became the most important government agency in the country, presided over by Guevara as Minister of Industry. Under Guevara's leadership, the private militia of NRA originated with 100,000 people and was used first to help the government control confiscated lands and supervise distribution, and then to establish cooperative farms. Expropriated lands included 480,000 acres owned by American companies. In retaliation, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower drastically cut imports of Cuban sugar, the main cash crop, which made Guevara, on July 10, 1960, deliver a speech to more than 100,000 workers in front of the presidential palace in a march calling for denouncing the behavior of the United States with economic aggression. In his view, Cuba's new man should have been able to overcome the selfishness and self-love that he so much hated because they were a characteristic of individuals in capitalist societies. In describing this new method of development, Guevara said the following: "There is a great difference between the development of free enterprise and revolutionary development, Che Guevara. In one of them, wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few lucky friends of the government, and the best dealers of cars and motorcycles. In the other, wealth is concentrated in the heritage of the people." One of Guevara's beliefs is that an integral part of continuing to foster a sense of national unity between the individual and the group is voluntary work. To show this, Guevara led and set the example, by working indefinitely on his job in the Ministry of Construction and even cutting sugarcane on his holidays. 86. He was known to work 36 continuous hours, calling for meetings after midnight and eating casual. This behavior was appropriate for Guevara and his new method of moral stimulation, where each worker was now required to meet the share in production of a certain number of goods. However, increases in wages were cancelled by providing an alternative, a system that allows workers, when their share exceeds, to obtain a certificate of praise, while workers who they fail to meet their quota and their wages are reduced. Guevara defended his personal philosophy and motivated it, saying, "Does not mean how much someone can eat, nor does it mean how many times he goes to the beach a year, or how many pieces of jewelry someone can buy from outside the country with his current expense. What really matters is for the individual to feel more complete with greater inner wealth and greater responsibility." Regardless of the advantages or disadvantages of Guevara's economic principles and programs, which soon ended in failure. Guevara's moral incentives program for workers caused a rapid decline in productivity and a rapid rise in absenteeism. 88. On April 17, 1961, the United States trained 1,400 Cuban exiles to invade the island in the Bay of Pigs invasion. Guevara himself did not play a fundamental role in the fighting, because a day before the invasion a warship carrying forged Marines invaded off the western coast of Pinar del Rio, and the forces led by Guevara were directed to that area. Nevertheless, historians give Guevara credit, as he was executive director of the Cuban Armed Forces at the time, and he is entitled to a share of this victory. Author Ted Schulk explained the Cuban victory, which gives some credit to Guevara, saying, "The revolutionaries won because Che Guevara, as head of the Revolutionary Armed Forces Department and in charge of the militia training program, prepared very well for 200,000 men and women for the war." Guevara was also injured during this spread by the passing of a bullet in the cheek of his pistol when he fell from the clipboard and the shot was fired accidentally. Guevara was a practical engineer for Cuban-Soviet relations. And then he played a major role in bringing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles to Cuba from the Soviet Union that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 and brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. 95. During an interview with the British communist newspaper The Workers' Daily a few weeks after the crisis, Guevara was still angry at the perceived treachery of the Soviets and stated that if the missiles were under Cuban control they would have fired them immediately. 96. British correspondent Sam Russell, who spoke to Guevara at the time, pointed out mixed feelings, describing him as a warm person and a great intelligence man, but the missiles for him are like crackers. The Guevara missile crisis convinced that two of the world's great powers, the United States and the Union the Soviet, Cuba uses a stake in its global strategies. After that, he denounced the Soviets with almost every denunciation of the Americans. We have to continue in second part. Thanks for watching. Goodbye, my friends.